All right, welcome back to our third and final section of the Ecology Saturday Study Session Review. We're going to go ahead and look at the free response questions now. We're going to start by looking at the first short free response question. And let's look carefully. It says bacteria play a central role in biological roles. They may act as parasites, mutualistic symbionts, or decomposers. Select two. So let's go back here, excuse me. Whenever I do these, what are we going to do? We're supposed to select two of these. I put a box around the number that I need to write about. For each one that I choose, I need to describe how bacteria, the role of bacteria, and then I also need to discuss its ecological importance. So I like to circle the command words. So now I want to talk about two of these, whichever one you're the most familiar with. Go ahead and talk about this. Parasites is a pretty easy one. The one hint I'll give you, if you're stuck on how does it act as a mutualistic symbiont, think about the nitrogen cycle and how is it important? What role do bacteria play in that? Hopefully that'll help you. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video here. Remember to give a thoughtful, thorough response. I will look at your answers, and then we'll go ahead and look at the rubric for this, which I'm going to do right now. So for this one, things you could have written about the actions, how it benefits the parasite, but it's not beneficial for the host, and that would define its ecological role. The detail you could talk about how a disease is introduced or how the parasite is introduced. Other things you could have talked about how it serves as a limiting factor to keep control of the host population. You could have said it's a selective agent on host species. Nature selects the ones who are susceptible to it or not susceptible to it versus the ones who are not, or who are. So let's move on to the next one, the mutualistic symbiont. Remember this one, I try to give you a hint. We're looking at this one. Keeping this idea of nitrogen important, the availability of nitrogen. We're going to look at that here in just a little bit. And because of that, it's able to help out the other parts of the ecosystem. Let's just look at that really quickly. Let's look at exactly what that's talking about. This is the nitrogen cycle right here. And if you remember, there's nitrogen is going to be in the air. It's also going to be in the ground, and ground or water. And basically what we see here is this nitrogen in the air is unusable. Organisms cannot use it, not without first letting the nitrogen-fixing bacteria turn it into a usable form, and then, and only then, can it be used by the plants, and transferred to the animals, and so forth. So bacteria plays a very important role here. Let's go back to this one. Other things that you could have talked about, as a decomposer, you could have said it recycles nutrients. That's what decomposers do. Describe decomposers as what are they feeding on? Dead organisms and waste matter. Removing waste from waste products, cleaning up oil spills. Bacteria are used for that sometimes. And again, we talked about this earlier, the steps in the nitrogen cycle. But it can't be the same as what you talked about up here. So hopefully that helps for that one. Let's go ahead and look at the next one. This is number 2. In many ways, all organisms in a food web can be said to be solar powered. The producer level of a food web is responsible for the transformation of solar energy in the form that can be used by other living organisms. I come over here and I say discuss. What are we discussing? The flow of energy from producers to the very top carnivores in a food web, in terms of, and it also says in terms of the laws of thermodynamics. So laws of thermodynamics are always good to review. And just so you go into this question remembering those, remember first law says energy is never created or destroyed, it's only transferred. Another law says entropy or amount of disorder is always increasing, thus giving off heat. So I think this is a fairly easy one. Go ahead and give this one a shot, and we'll look at the rubric here in just a minute. All right, stuff you could have talked about for this one. Super important, always for food webs, food chains. Don't forget the 10% rule, how only 10% of that energy is transferred to the next trophic level, and the one above that as well. An explanation, where does that energy go? Where does 90% of that energy go? It's lost in the form of metabolism, heat. They're saying locomotion here. Down here, they're saying lost as heat / entropy. And this is where the second law of thermodynamics comes into place. Entropy is always increasing. Heat loss is always happening. You could have talked about explaining the energy pyramid, how there's most energies at the bottom of the pyramid and it works its way up. There's more energy at the producer level, not as much at the higher trophic levels. It's limited number of consumer levels, very few top carnivores. That's compared to the number of producers at the bottom of the energy pyramid. And then this goes into the first law, illustrates how, remember, energy being transferred from solar energy to chemical energy. And this one says conversion of chemical energy to chemical energy, meaning our molecules ATP that ultimately provide us with our energy we need. All right, next and last question here is the long free response. I'm sorry, this is kind of hard to read on the slides, but let's look at it together. Describe pattern of changes in communities over time. The graph below shows changes in plant diversity is what we're looking at here. So here's plant diversity, species diversity in an agricultural field in this particular biome. And down here we're looking at it's abandoned, and we're following from year 0 when it was abandoned. How does the biodiversity, or the species diversity increase for these 1, 2, 3, 4 different categories of trees and shrubs? So look at this one. The first one says discuss the differences in plant diversity shown in the graph. So discuss differences in plant diversity in the graph. In other words, turn the graph into words. This should be a really easy one. It says also explain how those changes affect the animal species composition between year 0 and 120. I highlight that, between 0 and 120. If the plant species looks like this, what might the animal species look like that? Or what might that do to the animal species? Describe that. That should be a fairly easy one. Let's, in fact, go ahead and type your response right now, and then we'll go look at the answer for part A. So for part A, things you could have talked about. Remember, this was kind of an easy one. It's showing you more diversity in the shrubs. This is also saying there's a little less diversity in the understory. Differences in the rate. There is a rapid change in the ground flora, a slow change in the understory. Again, these are all about differences and change. Just describing the graph with words. You don't have to know any biology. It's just describing a graph. This one, the effect, what would be the effect on animal species? You say a pioneer community consists of small herbivores, insects, and other small ground-dwelling animals would start to come into existence. A climax community, we're going to talk here about the larger organisms, insects, birds, and mammals, is multi-layer. So gives you an idea for part A. Let's go back and look at part B. Part B says identify 2 biotic and 2 abiotic factors. And not only that, you have to discuss how each of them can influence the pattern of ecological succession. Remember, succession is how an ecosystem changes over time. So go ahead and give give your best answer to that for, remember, biotic living things, abiotic non-living things, and see what you come up with. All right, let's look at the answer for part B. 2 biotic, 2 abiotic, and things you could have talked about for the biotic portions of this. How there's competition, predation, herbivores, and then you could start talking about a lot of the density-dependent stuff, disease, parasitism, how the seeds would be dispersed, and even human impact plays important in biotic factors. Other things you could look at for the abiotic factors, things that are density-independent almost, things that you can't control. The organisms can't control the climate, the amount of rainfall, light, all these abiotic, non-living things were each worth a point, up to 2 points maximum. So hopefully that wasn't a bad one either. Let's go back and look at the last question, part C, design a controlled experiment. I tell my students whenever you see this word, it almost doesn't get any easier than this, designing a controlled experiment. Just remember all the parts of an experiment. And then also keep in mind they're going to give you be very specific about what they want you to talk about, and they're looking at how diversity of plant species is affected by large herbivores. So those are the two things you need to talk about in your controlled experiment. Just really quick review, what are some of the parts of a controlled experiment? Don't forget your hypothesis, your control, all of your variables, your control variable, what are you going to keep to compare this to show there's no change. Don't forget your independent variable or manipulated, the one that's going to be changed. The dependent variable, the one that's going to respond to that. You always get points for applying numbers. How are you going to measure those? What units are you going to use? Different variables. Don't forget, we talk about the control. We also talked about if it's a controlled experiment, what variables are you going to keep the same? Other things I could think of really quickly, we talked about a hypothesis is always if and then, and let's see, I think that's just about everything. But try to use all those when you design a controlled experiment, guys. Those are easy if you can get all the parts of the experiment. So let's go ahead and look at another easy one. Don't forget, repeat the experiment. That's easy points right there to make sure your numbers are accurate. Let's see what they came up with for part C of this one. Part C, and again, they're identifying the independent variable or the manipulated variable. In this case, things that would have been manipulated would have been the large, what did we say, were they going to be large cattle, large herbivores? Sorry, I have to go back to the question. The question says large herbivores. So you're going to change those. The dependent variable means what's being measured, and remember we were looking at the this one specifically says here count number of species, not observed diversity. It would have to be count the number of each species here, so it's the types of plant species. Also, you get points for variables being held constant. Okay, remember in a controlled experiment we try to only change one thing, maybe a couple things. Everything else is held constant. And this one says you have to name at least 3. So that's kind of interesting. Identify the control. And the control would be, if you're adding herbivores, then no herbivores would be an excellent control. Did you repeat your experiments, or did you use a large plot size or many plots? And then don't forget your hypothesis that has to relate to species diversity and how it's affected by the herbivores that you're adding. So I hope that was helpful, and you know a little bit more about ecology.